remember to record. Look at that. Okay, we are officially recording. We officially go. Hi, welcome to our Zoom class. Thank you for doing this with me today. As all of you here have heard me say, there's a specific way to be ready for class. If you're watching this video later, this still applies to you, except you have the ability to kind of hit pause and get the stuff ready. I know we all have different levels of we're used to using Zoom more or less. My favorite trick is this last one. This if Zoom window is full screen, you hit escape, then it's windowed, and that lets you kind of size it however you want. I know when I'm in like a Zoom faculty meeting, maybe I shouldn't tell you this, I'm a solitaire player. So I've got the faculty meeting on one side, and I've got a solitaire game going in the other. Not always, but often that kind of helps me think, having a thing to do. I'm a fiddler, I've got my fidget spinner and stuff in my office. So if you need to fiddle in whatever way you need to, great, but have something open to be able to type, to be able to respond. I am going to leave the screen open just for a second to let the person who just came in kind of see that. But then let's move on. Let me tell you what the big point here today. I'm assuming by now you know what your discourse community is. I'm assuming that you've taken some notes. That's all we talked about last time, right? How to take notes, how to do that well. So now I'm really curious about, once you've got those notes, how do you get those into your essay? How do you get them into a draft? With clarity, and with the word I keep using is smoothness. Maybe that's not the most academic-y word, but like a smooth, clear way to integrate. By the way, if your mic isn't muted, it's probably a good idea to kind of, in general, kind of leave it muted.
Understand gonna want me to talk to you.
That's you, Javier.
I can get the fuck out.
You can get the fuck out. All right, I'm gonna mute him for.
Let's go.
All right, Javier. In the future, remember, we can hear stuff. I muted you. It's all right. So here, I've got a number of steps that I'm going to walk you through today to practice integrating your content well. So here's the very first thing, and this is a question I actually want you to interact. This is the one and only time I am going to ask you to use the chat in Zoom. This is based on last week. I'm hoping by now you're starting to have an idea of what classifications you might have for the notes on your discourse community. And you can see on the right here, I'm always going to have like my thoughts for you on the left and my examples on the right. And I think the best way to do this, it's not required, but the best classifications, the best labels are if they're related in some way. So if you have, like, for instance, here are some ways that my discourse community is informal, but here's some ways it's formal. You see how those are kind of parallels of each other, right? They go back and forth. Or in a totally different essay, my second example there, if I have great ways my discourse community welcomes newcomers, but also how leaders protect newcomers, right? So they're both related in that way. And my third one, they're both classifications about specialized language, maybe language they use that anyone can understand, but also specialized language that's really, really hard. So let me pause and be quiet and ask you to actually share what are at least two classifications, two chunks, two labels that you might actually use in your assignment, that you might actually break up some of the evidence you found. You might categorize it in those ways. Will you type it into the chat so that we can all see it there? I'll give you a second to kind of open that up. It's over. Chat is over here if you can't find it. I'll give you like 2 or 3 minutes. Diehard fans and new and fake fans, perfect. I like how they're related. I would say, even if you haven't thought about it yet, even if you don't know, definitely try to come up with something right now on the spot. I'm not going to hold you to it. let me just say for the people on the watching the recording, I'm hopefully while this is pausing, you'll do it too. So I don't know if the video will include the chat. I don't think it will, but so far I've only seen one. They're thinking about it still. I like that. Fans of the thing you're writing about overall, and then drilling down, zooming in a little more onto Korean fans. That makes a lot of sense. So Dayan is talking about its terminology, kind of specialized language stuff. I'm trying to like take what you're writing there and kind of drill it down, trying to summarize that. Like, so there's some that take time to learn and some that anyone could understand. That's it. So it's specialized language that anyone could get versus like you've got to be taught it. I see. Yeah. I'm seeing kind of a church in general classification versus my youth group. I could see how those are both overlapping kind of discourse communities you might write about in the same essay. That makes sense. Yeah. My guess is you could even go deeper probably. I wonder, like, in the youth group, I noticed evidence of this kind of a thing. Um, I especially like it when you classify, if you're the one who has to label it in some way, if you give it a title, you say, well, I noticed this collection of behaviors or words or phrases, and I've decided to call that blank. So the less you have to name it, I think the simpler it sounds. So I think uh, not just for you, but for everyone. Like if you can give it a name, I think that's awesome. Well, let me go on, but you are going to need this to move on. You're going to need to be able to do the exercises for today. You're going to need at least one classification, one thing that you could name. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on my very first one. I'm going to focus as an example on ways that my discourse community is informal. So let me move on to step 2. Like I said, I do want you to choose one of those classifications to focus on for some exercises that we're going to do right here live, or of course, if you're watching the video. And what I want you to do is, remember at the beginning, I asked you to have your notes out. If you don't have any notes, you're just gonna have to go by memory or even go by expectation, but do try to find a piece of evidence that you can play with today and try to write into a fake paragraph or maybe even a real paragraph that you'll actually use. And you can see I'm saying here on the left that I think in some ways it's best if it's a quotation. So quick example, if I'm not making any sense to you, let's pretend hypothetically I'm writing about the discourse community that I keep talking about in class, the faculty in RU's College of Arts and Humanities, the 20-some faculty. And let's say my focus, my classification, my number 1 over here is ways that they're informal. Okay, sweet. So what's a piece of evidence? Well, let's say I interviewed some faculty. Like I literally emailed or stopped by their office. And let's say I talked to Professor Jen Jenkins, who's in the English department. Her office is a couple doors down. And let's say she gave me this quote down here at the bottom. That's the evidence I'm going to work on. So the question for you is, do you today, to work on, do you have a quote? Do you have like something you can copy and paste, or someone you've talked to, or something you heard? If so, awesome. Find that, get it out in front of you, and be ready to type or handwrite based on that. If you don't, what's another summary of something that you could notice, an observation that is interesting in some way? So I'm going to be quiet again for about a minute while you kind of find that. But everything else we do is going to be based on this. So you have to find some sort of focus, some kind of evidence, or you're going to have to make something up so that you're not just bored sitting here. If you're with me, can you give me like a thumbs up or some kind of a response if you know how to do that? And I know there's different kind of nonverbal ways you can clap or thumbs up. So if you can find that, go for it. If you don't feel thumbs up, don't do anything yet. I don't see a lot of thumbs up, so I'm gonna pause for one more minute, kind of let people kind of decide what's your focus for today. Again, either real evidence, hopefully, or fake if you just want to practice. All right, I'm gonna move on. Hopefully you're feeling at least close enough to okay that's okay. Um, let's keep moving. Step three, right? So now you've picked your focus for today, and I'm actually going to ask you to write. I know this is a little crazy. I'm going to ask you to pretend that you're in the middle of a paragraph, like you're in the middle of the essay. You've already written an intro. Pretend that's there. And let's pretend you're going to start a paragraph that focuses on that particular classification, that particular one that you decided, that particular label or something you focused on. And I want you to pretend that you're going to write a whole paragraph about that, kind of about all the evidence you found about ways that your discourse community is the way that your classification names it. I know that sounds a little confusing, but you can see my example over here. I think makes it a little easier. So let's pretend that dot, dot, dot means that there's an intro, right? There's earlier paragraphs before this. But then here's my very first sentence of a new paragraph. And let me just go back really quick to remind you that my focus for today is ways that faculty are informal. Okay, so if I start here, as I observed this group of faculty, one theme surfaced repeatedly. Even though these are professionals with lots of degrees, they're also very informal. So again, my first sentence says to my readers, hey guys, here's the classification here, here's the label I'm using here, it's about the informality. And then I decided that my one topic sentence wasn't enough. It kind of wasn't clear. So I decided to add a kind of a second topic sentence, a second sentence clarifying what I mean by that. Or really doing this kind of thing on the left, kind of judging, assessing, kind of saying, not only are they that way, but here's how I feel about it. This informality walks the line between being a strength and a weakness. I'd say that some students find the informality useful while others are turned away by it. So I'm both it's telling my readers, hey, this is a paragraph about informality, don't miss it. Second, I think it's kind of good and kind of bad. It depends. So let me, again, pause. I'm going to do this a lot today. Let me pause for a few minutes, couple minutes, 3 minutes, and ask you to do that. Write the first sentence of a paragraph. I'm not going to ask you to turn this in. This is totally private. I'm not going to ask you to write it in the chat unless you want to. Give it a go, though. Let me also say that if you're baffled, if you're like, this makes no sense, it is okay to type chat. It's okay to ask out loud. You can also privately chat just to me if that's easier. So I'm going to move on in a second, but I think the key way to know if you're doing this right is, one, is it clear what classification you're talking about? And the awesomest thing is if there's some kind of judgment in there too, right? Some kind of assessment, some kind of a, you as the writer kind of telling the reader what you think about that. So um, with diehard fans or new fake fans, maybe your first paragraph just says, um, when I look at my discourse community, one thing I see is a lot of diehard fans. And when I think about diehard fans, I think of people uh, who bring a lot of energy and excitement to this community, but also sometimes take it too far. You know, I'm just imagining that might be it. I could do that with any of these, right? I could kind of introduce it. Let me be quiet. No, not be quiet. Let me hop back in and move to step 4. So again, you've got your topic sentence. You've got a way that you're walking your telling your reader what is this paragraph going to be about. And now I want to get into the quote sandwich, which I mentioned briefly to all of the classes on last week, last Wednesday and Friday, but we didn't get too detailed in any of the classes. And one, we got a little further than others. But I want to let your paragraph continue. And you can see mine, this is like the last words of that first sentence that I just did. But I want you to start transitioning into the evidence that you chose earlier, way back in step 1 or 2. I remember I have a quote from Jen Jenkins, from Professor Jenkins in the English department. And I want to build up to that. I don't want to just like, let me go back for a second. I don't just want to like say, they're very informal, they walk the line. And then Professor Jenkins says, I think that would be too sudden. It would be too like, readers are going to be like, what are you even talking about? What is this? So when we talk about the top bread of the quote sandwich, what we're saying is a clear phrase that gets into the specific evidence. And you can see it's best if you continue to judge or assess it. If you continue to tell your reader, how am I supposed to feel about this and how do you feel about it? So I used a very clear, very common phrase, for example. You might want to do that too. Um, you could use other phrases like, one example of this is, or to see this in action, or a detail that will help you understand this, you know, any phrase like that that kind of very specifically moves from intro the paragraph into the evidence. And you can see what I wrote here. For example, in one conversation I had with Professor Jennifer Jenkins, she shared an informal perspective that could only be perceived as a good thing by students. Again, this is me as the writer interpreting it, right? So you know you're about to hear something that I think students see as positive. I'm telling you in advance, hey guys, a quote's coming and the quote's going to be positive. Read it that way, please. So can you do the same thing? Can you write that? Don't get into the quote yet. Don't start the quote. I'm going to do that on the next slide. But for a second, build us into it. Write the top bread of the sandwich. Give you about 30 more seconds and I'll pop in. let's keep moving. Again, even if you're going slow, if you're not keeping up with this, that is okay. You can watch the video later. You can kind of keep in mind this sort of possible template. So when we talk about the quote sandwich, remember I mentioned last week that the middle, the meat or the veggies, if you're a vegetarian, the heart of the quote sandwich is the actual quotation. I'm calling it a quote sandwich, but this actually works for other kinds of evidence too, like if you're summarizing something. So in my example here, you can see in the yellow, that's where the meat starts. This is the top bread. I don't know if you can see my mouse. This is the top bread up here, same top bread I just wrote a second ago. And the yellow marks, this is my moving into the meat part itself. And what was I about to say about that? I forget, but let me define a little bit what I mean by smoothly. So I'm going to show a few slides over here on the left, a few suggestions of how to do this well, and while you can continue to see that over there on the left. So for instance, I want to share 2 smooth practices that I think will really help you get into the quotation or the summary grammatically really well. And then again, I'll pause and let you actually work it in if you have something. A really common way that I just did is verb, comma, space. I know it seems silly to even tell you where to put a space, but people do forget this. So the most common is things like this, right? She said, verb, comma, space, quotation. Verb, comma, space, quotation. Verb, comma, space, quotation. Uh, the point here is really the comma. If you have a verb right beforehand, or even a verb really close to beforehand, the most common way to introduce your quote is with a comma beforehand. That's not the only way. Let me show you a different one. Sometimes people have a complete sentence before the quote, and in that case, they use a colon instead, not a semicolon. A colon is the 2 dots. I don't know if you can see that. Let me kind of stop moving my mouse, and maybe it'll be clear. She said something horrible, complete sentence, right? He suggested an obvious point, complete sentence. So when you feel yourself using a complete sentence, that's when you put a colon instead. That's the way colons work. They follow grammatically complete sentences where if you read it, you're like, oh yeah, that's a whole sentence. But if I say, she said, that's not a complete sentence, right? It's waiting for the set. She said what? What did she say? You're not saying. They disagreed by saying, ... No, so that's how you know if you need a comma or a colon, is based on if the words right before the quote are one or the other. So let me pause and again give you a chance to try introducing your piece of evidence. If you don't have a quotation, you could still do this. You could still summarize and say, she answered by saying something like this, or when I saw the players on the field doing this, or I in the discussion board I was on, I heard people writing this. You could still do this sort of thing, but some of what I want you to get is like actually the mechanics, actually the grammar and punctuation of getting into a quote. So give that a shot. Try to get into your quote, and then I'll show you a few errors to avoid in a second. Now I'm not going to give you as much time because I'm hoping you already had the quote ready and you already did kind of the harder job of the top bread, kind of telling us what to do. Now all you do is just kind of put it in. Let me point out a few common mistakes people sometimes make here, just so you can see if you in your first draft right now did any of these. These are all like punctuation related things, not that big a deal. I know sometimes we have we want to use the colon after a verb like that. You do sometimes see that. There are published examples of this, so it's perhaps wrong for me to say it's wrong, but I think it's less common. I think it's a less of a good idea. I can explain to you in detail if you want to know more why, if you show me that. But I would say if you, in that case, the person using that verb should have made that a comma instead. I see people using spaces all over the place. And again, I know this is a little wacky, but this person forgot to type a space after the comma, and you can see how that kind of looks wacky, right? It kind of it's all squeezed too much together. Put the space after your comma. Sometimes people leave off any punctuation. They have a verb and they just kind of dive right in. Again, I'm just telling you, you can get into the habit. If there's a verb, use the comma. We also have the flip side where people will have the complete sentence. She says something horrible, and they'll use a comma instead of the colon. That's incorrect because they used the comma and didn't use the colon. That's technically a run-on sentence. I've talked to quite a few of you about comma splices, a particular kind of run-on sentence. That's a comma splice, really. It's like a complete sentence and then comma the next thing. Well, the comma isn't strong enough to hold that together. It's just not allowed. I know it's annoying. I wish we could change that, but we can't. Finally, I see this a lot too. Kind of like complete sentence, period, and then we start the sentence with a quote. I want to strongly urge you in your academic writing, in most cases, to not ever start a sentence with a quote. This is not a rule. This is just a practice. But I think if you're always thinking to yourself, how can I get into it? You see how I did it, just the she said. If I always have like a little bit of a thing and then the quote, what it does is it makes your reader feel less bumpy. Yeah, I think bumpy is the right word, right? It's gonna, she said something, boom, boom, like a speed bump, quote. So what the commas and the colons do is they kind of smooth it out. That's why I keep using the word smooth. The last thing I didn't type here, but notice in every single one of these places, I correctly put the period inside of the quotation marks. Guys, if you didn't do this in the one you just wrote a second ago, put that period inside. There's one and only one time to put a period outside the quotation marks. Same with commas. Put them in, put them in, put them in, please, please, please. One more quick thing just before we kind of move on past step 5. You might have a quote sandwich in your essay where you're pulling from Meltzer, your meat or veggies. The quote idea you have is from that article about discourse communities. That's a good thing. You're required to refer to the Meltzer essay. Part of this essay is about proving that yours is a discourse community following their definitions. So in that case, you sometimes will have this situation where you introduce Meltzer, you use a verb, you use a comma, however you get into it, and then you use a page number in quotation marks. And we haven't talked too much about citation. We're not going to too much in this class. Really, that's more of a RHET 102 thing. But the rule is simple. If we already know that Meltzer is named, right? Like if the build up to it makes it really clear, you put a little parentheses, you put the page number from his article, not the page number of the PDF, the page number like of the article itself, and then you put the period outside. This is the only time you put the period outside the quotation marks because it goes outside the parentheses. It's kind of saying, oh yeah, that parentheses is part of this whole sentence, right? The sentence doesn't end, it doesn't end, it does not end, boom, now it's over. Whew. All other ones, let me go back really quick. It's on the inside again. Cool. Okay, I think you've done that. You've got your thing. I could stop talking at you. Let's finally move on to step 6. In the quote sandwich, you will not be surprised to hear, dun, 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 we're talking about the bottom bread, which I think is the most often neglected. I don't know if it's the hardest. I don't know if it's the easiest to forget. I don't know. But the point is to follow your quotation or summary, to follow your evidence with at least one sentence, maybe more, that draws attention to what you want us to notice in that quote. To say, hey, this might seem obvious to you guys, but let me tell you what I want you to think about here. You can see what I did over here, right? I wrote, notice how Professor Jenkins' informality has a deeper student-centered purpose. She isn't just being informal for fun. So that notice how is one common phrase to use. I gave you a few other examples down here. Maybe things like that or versions of those will help you as you try this. So again, I'll be quiet. Try to follow your quote with a here's why this works. Probably related to your classification, right? Probably in some way related to your topic sentence for this paragraph. What do you want us to notice in that quote? 30 more seconds. We'll dive in. So again, if any of this is especially hard or weird, um, email me, send me the paragraph you're working on today if you want to, and say, here's what I did. Do you think I did this right? It doesn't feel right to me. We can talk about it. So here's the thing. I don't have a slide for this yet, but let's think about where you're at, right? I'm going to go back for a minute through the steps. Um, you've got your focus. You've got a paragraph that has a topic sentence that introduces the quote, gives the quote, and then follows up the quote with bottom bread. But a paragraph often is going to have more than one piece of evidence in it. Often you think of your classification. In my case, these professors are so informal, and you're going to have lots of ways. You're not just going to say like, one quote from Professor Jenkins doesn't prove that this college is informal. Like to be able to draw a conclusion, have a classification, you got to have multiple pieces of evidence. So I need more ways that they're informal. You can imagine maybe in my notes, I've got all sorts of things written down or ideas. Maybe they'll come up with them as I do. But my paragraph probably isn't over yet. My paragraph probably has to bring up more evidence that I might walk through this whole quote sandwich thing multiple times. It might be kind of complicated, right? I might kind of have one big piece of top bread and then bring up a lot of evidence and then have a whole piece of bottom bread, or I might kind of repeat the sandwich multiple times in one paragraph. It's kind of hard to say. So let's assume right now, I'm not going to give you a chance to do this right now, but let's assume that you want to move on and transition into the next evidence. I think the key is to make that transition feel smooth. I keep using that word smooth, right? That I want there to be some sort of a transition there. So I don't know if you noticed, it's like what we already did kind of ended here. This was my bottom bread. I kind of had like a 2-sentence bottom bread. And then I had to start thinking, how can I move on to the other examples of informality? So you can see I started here. Even though it doesn't come across well to all students, it's at least clear that when these faculty are informal, they think they're doing it for the students. But another example hints at informality's problems. So you can tell even in the same paragraph, I'm going to share both the positive and the negative things about informality. That's not a surprise because I hinted at that earlier. So I'm not going to keep going, but you can see where this is going, right? I very specifically told my reader, hey, here comes another example. And I already kind of know what it is. Like in some ways, this transition is also a top bread. It's also like a here's what's coming. So I think I could just move probably right into the next paragraph and into the next evidence. I could say, once I heard someone say this, and just bam, there I am. So here's my whole thing. And I know it seems a little silly. I'm not going to read it at you. Let me just shut up for a minute and let you read it, because I think when you see it all together, this is the example of the kind of writing that I think somewhere in this essay I'm hoping that you'll do. So let me pause and think about what I'm doing when you read it. You might notice this paragraph is getting long. I know it doesn't look as long. It wouldn't look as long in like an MLA style essay as it does here on the screen, but I think that length in this case is actually okay. I know it might sound like I'm contradicting myself. I'm always Mr. Have short paragraphs, that's fine, and that's okay. Maybe if I feel like I really want more short paragraphs at this, but that could be my next paragraph, kind of, and there'd be like a section on informality. That's fine too. But sometimes people say to me, Dr. Simon, I just can't write anything. I feel like this is so short. All I'm doing is just kind of, I don't have anything to say. And almost this lesson is almost like my answer to that. My answer is, well, did you Did you start a paragraph by introducing us to the classification? Did you introduce us to a piece of evidence? Did you then give the evidence? Did you then comment on the evidence? And then did you just then transition into the next one? I feel like if you're doing all that, that's like so many sentences, and it's hard to be short when you're thinking that way. Two other interesting things about what you're seeing here. Hopefully you can see that yellow pop up. Um, I noticed that almost intuitively, I'm regularly referring back to things that readers already know, and I'm often referring back at the beginning of my sentences. And what that's doing is it's making little segues. It's making little references that makes the whole thing feel smooth. I have writers all the time say to me, "That just meant I wish I had more flow in my writing." And I'm always like, well, what do you mean by flow? And I think the answer is this. So some of it is just like transitions. Some of it's like pronouns. Like as I observed this group of faculty, of course, that refers back to something that's already been mentioned. This informality, the informality I just mentioned in the last sentence, for example, an example of the thing I just mentioned in the last sentence, she said, the she said is of course referring to someone who I just just mentioned. Notice the thing in what I just mentioned, that student-centered purpose, the purpose I just referred to in the last sentence, this faculty group that I've mentioned a million times, even though it refers back to informality I just mentioned. Like, I know that seems like overkill almost, but I honestly think that to most readers, that won't feel like overkill. To most readers, it'll feel smooth. It'll feel like it's transition-y. Yes, it is possible to go overboard on that. Yes, it is possible to over-repeat yourself. These are real worries for some writers. But can I say I've been teaching RHET 101 here. This is my 9th year. Um, and I would say 85% of the time, I wish there was more of this. 15% of the time, I'm like, okay, you're going overboard, sure. So I'd rather you over it than under it. One other thing, I didn't do this on purpose, but something I noticed, I don't know if you can see, if I go between these two slides, the white bold things. There's 2 colons and 2 semicolons that I'm highlighting. I'm gonna make them keep turning on and off so you can notice. I noticed that I've been talking to a lot of you about comma splices, about sentences that just kind of, you have a sentence, let's use this as an example. A sentence, and the sentence ends, and you accidentally use a comma and then continue the next sentence. Many of you have heard me say this. And I want you to notice that one way to dodge that, if you find yourself finishing a sentence and wanting to say, I'm not done with this sentence, I have more to say about that same topic, I can't put a period, that would be too harsh, that would be too formal, too finalizing, you know? The semicolon, not the colon, the one that has the period and the comma, that's exactly what it does. It's like a weak period. It's like, let me put a period, but say these two ideas are still kind of related. So that's when I use it. Is the time that I think a lot of you are like, oh, I sense I need something. I guess I'll just use a comma. I think sometimes you use the comma because you don't know how to use semicolons, or you're afraid you're going to use it wrong. The rule about semicolons, the only rule you have to worry about, is that both sides have to be a complete sentence. In other words, if I read these parts, that has to be a complete sentence, like if I did put a period there. This next part has to be a complete sentence if I did put a period. Same thing over here. That has to be complete, and the second part has to be complete. If it is, the semicolon is legal. Use them. Maybe don't overuse them. Don't use it in every single sentence, but use it some. It's a little different from the colon because the colon kind of announces after the colon there will be something. As I observed this group of faculty, one theme surfaced repeatedly, colon. You know that what comes after the colon is the one theme down here. But another, example of informalities problems, colon, I'm about to tell you. So they work somewhat differently than a semicolon. The semicolon doesn't have to have that sense of the first thing is building up to the second part. They just have to be connected in some way. So just so you know, keep that grammatical option in mind. So let me sum up the main takeaways here. You can see this. This is a formula, sure. A lot of times I'm kind of you don't need formulas. You should let what you noticed guide your writing. I still think that's true. But I think some of you are feeling a little like, I don't know how to turn all these notes into an essay. So use the formula, but be flexible with it. If you find yourself saying, oh, I'm supposed to put my bottom bread here, and I know that, and I get the idea, but it just doesn't feel right. Trust yourself, trust your gut. Ask me, ask the Writing Center, Never assume your evidence speaks for itself. That's what the bottom and top RHET do, is they explain the evidence to your reader. Guys, in this evidence, it is your job to classify. I'm looking for your creative classifications. That's almost the main thing I'm looking for. Um, you could have just shown me notes. You could have gone out with a video and like said, all right, Dr. Simon, here's all the stuff I noticed. I don't want that. I want to know how you classified and ordered it to tell me what it is you noticed about the stuff you found. Um, Using quotations smoothly with all that punctuation, I do think it makes you look good. Um, you might say, well, who cares if I use the right comma before that? You can still understand me. And I would say, that's actually true. I could still understand you. That would be in some ways okay, but it would also make it look, a metaphor I used in my first year STEM class today, it would almost make it look like you didn't iron your clothes before a job interview. It'd be like, oh, really? You want me to hire you, but you're just, you got a really wrinkly shirt and pants there. Um, or if you get to take a shower, if you get to put deodorant on, it's those little things that you're like, you could still be really smart. You could be super, the perfect person for that job, but there's still that question of, well, why didn't you clean up that little thing? That's how that stuff comes across, just so you know. And of course, that last reference, refer back often to the things you already said. So that is all I have. I'm going to pause here for a second. If you are done and you're like, hey, I'm ready to go, I need to run another class, log off. If you want to stay and chat for 5 more minutes, we've got it to ask me any specific questions, or if you want to ask the group any questions. Remember, don't come to class this Wednesday or Friday. I will not be there. I'll be in my office instead. But I will officially stop sharing and let you go. Okay, so how do you feel? Either goodbye or ask me questions while I drink some water. I'll
Thank
stop.
you. Have a nice rest of your day, Dr. Sutton. We'll see you next week.
You too. Thanks a lot.